Hello, everyone. Welcome to Freedom is the Cure, where we aim to show that whatever the societal ailment, freedom is always a cure. I'm Paul Dragoo, the Communications Director for the John Birch Society. Thank you for tuning in. So in 1967, the CIA sent out classified document number 1035-960 to some of its agents and overseas stations. Despite the CIA being an agency that's supposed to work abroad, this document was a how-to manual on manipulating Americans into believing the Warren Commission report, the U.S. government's investigatory conclusion of President John F. Kennedy's assassination. The CIA justified its domestic mission with the excuse that American criticism of American government will spread to other countries. The problem was that Americans believed Lee Harvey Oswald's final words, "I'm just a patsy." The document cited polls indicating that more than half of Americans weren't buying the Warren Commission's conclusion. And among the most popular conspiracies people suspected was the one implicating the CIA in the assassination. This propaganda instruction manual specifically advised agents to use their, quote, friendly elite, unquote, contacts in political and media circles to manipulate public opinion. It laid out very specific arguments that friendly political and media assets should make, including that conspirators who know what they're doing would not use a loser like Oswald for such a high-profile job. It also cited books that were critical in the investigation, along with counterpoints to discredit the arguments in those books. Here's another. On October 30, 1993, the Washington Post newspaper published an op-ed by then senior editor Richard Harwood titled "Ruling Class Journalists," in which he admitted that some of the most widely read newspapers and magazines in America were in the propaganda business. He said that journalists, quote, do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy, they help make it, unquote. He cited a long list of influential American people who were members of the deep state implementation vehicle, Council on Foreign Relations, people who held influential positions in the Wall Street Journal, in the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and the New York Times. And more recently, the Twitter files verified that the FBI and likely the CIA, among other three-letter government agencies, burrowed their way into Twitter to censor and control information. There's no doubt that elements of the federal government are very invested in manipulating public belief. When John Birch Society founder Robert Welch founded the organization, his primary goal was to help people learn the truth about what was really going on. He said, "Education is our total strategy and truth our only weapon." Welch knew that if Americans truly understood what was happening, the insider class had no chance of installing their one world technocratic government. Today, we'll be discussing government propaganda, the consequences of it, and what we should and can do about it. But before we dive in, please remember to follow our social media and podcast channels and like and share this episode. Like with most truth tellers, big tech restricts our message heavily because we do not fit their propaganda narrative. So I'm fortunate today to be joined by one of my favorite commentators from the New American. That's Daniel Natal of the Daniel Natal Show. Daniel, thanks for joining me, man.
Hey, thanks for having me, Paul. Good to be here.
Yeah. Hey, listen, I wanted to ask you first and foremost, Daniel, is everything a lie?
I remember we went out to lunch, Paul, and just for the viewers, yeah, that was the theme of Paul's discussion regarding talking to his son, having to explain reality to his son and just telling him how many like false narratives there were. Yeah, there was a great interview between Yuri Bezmenov, the former KGB guy, and G. Edward Griffin. And G. Edward Griffin, who belonged to the John Birch Society, he was talking to Bezmenov, and Bezmenov made an interesting comment. He said that the KGB spent about 85% of its budget on propaganda aimed at its own population. So while it was supposed to be a counterespionage agency, in fact, it was a ministry of propaganda. And he said that the CIA's budget was even bigger. You know, so we think of the CIA, oh, they're fighting spies or they're overseas. No, like 85 to 90% of their budget was just propagandizing the public. Like most notably, as an example, they would have many front companies. This came out during the Church Commission in the 1970s. One of those was called Capital Cities, and it was run by William Colby. He was the CEO of Capital Cities, and he would later go on to be the head of the CIA. And Capital Cities bought up, as an example, Disney, which owned ABC News and all these other kind of outlets. And so you would see CIA propaganda being disseminated through, say, for instance, as a prominent example, when they did the TV show Lost. It was a big hit, and one of the things for it to get greenlit was, they were told that they had to add a pro-torture theme because the CIA was going through the Abu Ghraib torture scandal, and so even though the viewers weren't aware of it, they had written an entirely new character, and put him in there. He was an Iraqi torturer, and they had these episodes where they extracted the truth through torture, and torture isn't really bad after all. And people watching this had no idea that this was, CIA embedded propaganda in the TV shows that they were watching to kind of mold public opinion. So yeah, I mean, whoever controls the narratives essentially controls the culture, and whoever controls the culture controls the society. So
Have you by any chance ran across or read that op-ed that Harry Truman wrote, I believe sometime in 63 or 64 for the Washington Post about the CIA, where he essentially says, whatever created the CIA. I don't know if it was the OSS at the time, but what he said, its intention was to kind of to aggregate all this information so the president can make a good decision. And, he said it's gotten out of hand. The CIA he used cloak and dagger, the words cloak and dagger in there. And he was just, his conclusion was that the CIA needs to go back to doing what it was intended to be. I think yours and mine and everyone else who's sane's argument would probably be more like the CIA needs to be disbanded. But it's interesting that you mentioned the whole loss thing. I mean, I had no idea. It's like going back to, I mean, why? What's the deal? What is it? I mean, would you say they would argue that they're protecting American interest, or is it, as what we believe, and that is it is just purely perpetuating this move toward globalism?
yeah, well, just to hit your first part, you asked about Harry S. Truman. I think that was like a month or two after Kennedy was assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, yeah, he regretted signing off in the CIA, and he called them an American Gestapo. And what's interesting about that, you mentioned the Washington Post, that recently Pepe Escobar, the Brazilian journalist, he said that the New York Times was essentially the mouthpiece of the State Department, and that the Washington Post was the mouthpiece of the CIA. So
Oh.
for Harry Truman to like say that, on that particular platform was extremely trenchant. And I forget the second part of what you said about the.
Well, I guess I listed three examples as an introduction there, and I mean, you had the Washington Post's own editor in chief who's saying it's like, look, we're actually we provide we produce propaganda, and yet here we live in this. Well, it doesn't matter what the second part of it is. I guess my next question is, it's like, how do people not know that this is still happening? I know that we have really low trust polls regarding the media, but who is still watching? Like you watch, for instance, I think lately we've been seeing that CNN, their viewer rates going down. They say it plummeted down to 450,000, and I'm reading that, and I'm like, who in the world are these 450,000 people watching CNN on a daily basis?
Exactly. Just the airports and bowling alleys,
That's kind of
hospitals. Yeah, raising the numbers. I mean, almost nobody's like watching it. But you made an interesting point. You made a reference to the Council on Foreign Relations. And 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, the Council on Foreign Relations kind of did a study. What were the 25 most influential newspapers in the United States? And they systematically bought controlling interests in all of those newspapers. And then they basically could control, the narrative. What news stories were propagated, what narratives were propagated, what themes were hit upon, and in a very structured way. And so that started with newspapers. Then, of course, it went into radio when radio came of age, and went into television. And so, I mean, since its very foundation, mass media has been used to manipulate the public. There's one of the godfathers of propaganda, Edward Bernays. He wrote a book called Crystallizing Public Opinion, and I think it was in 1926 or thereabouts. And he said that for the first time since Aristotle, we have a new form of government beyond the classical forms of government of like monarchy, aristocracy, republic. And he said this would be, like technocracy, rule by propaganda, ruled by media manipulation, and it's the first time it could happen because it's the first time we had mass media, and so he was talking very, very explicitly. He said in that book as well that the ruling class was the safest now as it has ever been, because the public is being, manipulated and divided, so they can't really unify to ever go against, the aristocrats like they might in the Middle Ages. And he said, so they're the safest they are now. And by the way, before I forget, just really quickly, and I know I'm rambling, but there was a book called what was it? It was Democracy, Capitalism, and Socialism or something. And it was by Joseph Schumpeter. I'm mangling the title, but Joseph Schumpeter was an Austrian economist. And he made a really interesting point. He said in there that mass college like had all these effects. And he basically was echoing Gustave Le Bon from the 1890s in France. And both men said that mass college had really destabilizing sociological effects because it took people out of the productive economy, right? The people who make things, so the trades and all that, and it channels them into white collar jobs. But the problem is there's not enough white collar jobs. So there's mass unemployment, there's mass underemployment, and Le Bon in particular said that it leads to the worst forms of socialism because they become embittered, because they basically have no skills, and they're poor, and they think they're too good for work. And so Schumpeter makes that same point in the 1930s. He says that you're going to get a bunch of disgruntled people, and they can't really find a place because they've never learned a trade. They don't know anything about business. And he said, so what tends to happen is they tend to go into jobs with very weak and watery benchmarks. And he said one of those is journalism. And he said, so a lot of them basically become court reporters, court stenographers for power, like people in the Middle Ages. Like you would get like a benefactor, wealthy benefactor in the Middle Ages, like Shakespeare, and he would have some rich guy, and he would write poetry for the rich guy, and it's basically propaganda. And he said that's the modern equivalent, is all of these college kids who really don't have any useful skills. They become court propagandists, state propagandists. And so that was interesting from the 1930s.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because when I was trying to change my vocation, essentially I wanted to get paid to write, but as you probably know, there's very few ways to actually get paid to write. Nobody wants to pay writers. So I took the easiest entryway, and that was into journalism. But I realized that even the entry level journalism jobs like they wanted like J degrees, like degrees, and I'm thinking it's like, well, that's kind of crazy. It's like I'm not gonna go to like 2 or 3 years, whatever, of school just to get the same entry level job. I eventually tricked someone into getting me the job, and and before the year was over, I had won a national award for investigative reporter. All to say, it's not that hard, but I mean, it's like a lot of that stuff you can pick up. Now, you had mentioned that we have more people with white collar jobs, and because I guess we don't have, there's less people with practical skills. Do you think there's a correlation between the fact that I mean, we know that, people know how to do fewer things. I think the old joke is that, men don't know how to change tires anymore. And I think there's some truth to that. But do you think there's a correlation between the fact that we have less practical skills, especially with our hands, and a lack of critical thinking? I mean, you look around, you would thought that by now everyone had picked up on the fact that mainstream news is I mean, it's just strictly propaganda.
Yeah, no, that's a really profound point. I don't think I've ever read a study on that, but that would deserve, like $400,000 grant from some institute. That's a really
I'll
great
take
study.
it.
There was a book though. I'll mention this. There was a book called Microtrends Squared by Mark Penn, and Mark Penn is a man of the left, and he ran Hillary Clinton's campaign when she first ran against Obama. And Mark Penn, interestingly, as a man of the left and as a Democrat, he made very many admissions, assuming he's got like a sympathetic audience. He just assumes other Democrats are reading, and the things that he makes admission to, one of them in the book, he had a chapter called "The Influential Elites," and he talks about that the more someone stays in college, the more propagandized they've become, and the less critical thinking faculties they have. He said that they basically are trained to obey authority rather than critical thinking. And he said that there's an irony. People who go to trade schools have far better developed critical thinking faculties. And people who tend to get advanced degrees, that if the New York Times says it, it must be true. If the Southern Poverty Law Center, he mentions it must be true. And he actually, as a Democrat, he went against the Russian collusion narrative with Trump. And he said in there 3 times, there was no proof for this. There was no evidence for this. But if you were a college graduate and you were watching Rachel Maddow, you're like, oh, this is an authority figure. It must be true, without any evidence, without any critical thinking. And this was from a Democrat, so yeah, I mean, like there is a definite correlation between people who, the longer they spend, like Noam Chomsky, another man of the left, he said that university is not a selection mechanism for intelligence. It's a selection mechanism for obedience. And that's basically what we see. We see a lot of obedient people, and they're so easy to manipulate and trick, and it's sad, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Noam Chomsky because Mark Crispin Miller out of NYU, he does, I think he teaches on propaganda. He's written books on propaganda, and he actually had a problem with the fact that of all people who should have noticed, I think it was with COVID, one of the elements of COVID tyranny. He kind of called out Noam Chomsky. He's like he's quick to notice the when especially if seeming elements of the right are involved in some sort of conspiracies or propaganda, but he's not so quick to pick up when the left is doing it. And his point was seeming it was basically that if it was the left pushing all the COVID tyranny, Noam Chomsky would have been all on it. But since it wasn't, he's disappointed that he wasn't on it. Um,
Well,
uh,
one of the things Noam Chomsky makes this point. Well, let me start here. There was a book by Alec Ross called Industries of the Future, and he had a really interesting quote in there. And the quote was to the effect that tech, information technology in the end of the 20th century made all the fortunes. So he said, large fortunes were made based on binary code at the end of the 20th century. He said in the 21st century, large fortunes will be made in genetic code. And so that's why you see people like Bill Gates jumping from Microsoft into biotech. And Noam Chomsky himself said something interesting. He said when he first started at MIT, like back in the 50s or 60s, he said MIT was surrounded by manufacturers, by chip manufacturers and different like technological manufacturers, components and stuff. He said MIT today is surrounded by nothing but biotech, biomedical science. And
mm,
so the money incentive, the money structure, the money flows are such that it would be very hard for Noam Chomsky to come against the COVID narratives because that's the bread and butter of like his employer. That's
mm.
and it goes back to that Upton Sinclair quote, never ask a man to like, go against, you'll never convince him if he has to like go against his paycheck or something. And that's kind of, Noam Chomsky. I'm paraphrasing that very badly, but
Yeah.
anyway.
Well, I think COVID tyranny, it provided an opportunity, or at least prompted what I think is true, and that's a lot of people awakening. And I think a large part of the reason for that was that simply that the reality was so blatantly contrary to what they were saying. And of course, we're still dealing with that. Just this morning I was going through, I think it was like, I don't know, like MSM News or something. And there were two stories in the rotator. One was about this 25-year-old soccer athlete who collapsed while, just after he missed a penalty kick against him. And then the next story is about the athlete from the Bills, Hamill, who collapsed, and he did, in front of millions of people. Anyway, he apparently did an interview, and in the narrative of the story was something about how it was brought up, vax conspiracy theories were brought up, and I thought just like how ironic. Here they are. Here's one story like dude just drops dead son. They use the word son, and we know where this is going. And then they're like, oh, these people talking about how it's vax caused or conspiracy theories. It's like at what point does the script flip to where to believe what mainstream media is conspiracy theory and reality becomes the mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mistake to think of media as a separate institution. So media is actually kind of tied in, like a Lego building blocks. They kind of click into each other with the military, with biomed, with the CIA. I mean, and that's why Eisenhower, he warned us about the military-industrial complex. It's a complex of different, kind of interests that interlock. And so, yeah, I mean, it's
But it's not
an interest.
supposed to.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. There's supposed to be like a firewall between these to keep their integrity. There's an interesting book by what's his name? Cass Sunstein. Cass Sunstein he wrote an interesting book called Nudge with Richard Thaler, economist Richard Thaler, and they talk about choice architecture. and how basically it used to be called social engineering, and how do you manipulate people through media narratives? How do you manipulate them technologically? How do you manipulate them with algorithms? And he wrote a really interesting book, a follow-up to Nudge, called and they call that nudging, by the way, nudging you in a particular direction. And
Nudging, yeah.
the follow-up was called How Change Happens, and he's very, very explicit in there, like how to manipulate the society. By the way, Cass Sunstein was hired by like the Democratic Party and later on Biden and stuff to deplatform conservatives. So that whole deplatform of the conservatives was overseen by Cass Sunstein. He describes in great detail like how it's done, what are the methodologies. He talks in the book about how Trump normalized, he moved the Overton window to normalize questioning globalization. And he said, before Trump, I think it was like 17% of the populace. And then after Trump, it was like 67% of the populace. They panicked, and they call that a norm entrepreneur. Somebody who makes, questioning acceptable, makes a position acceptable. And so Trump was a norm entrepreneur for the questioning of the globalization. And at that point, they were like, he's got to go. So I mean, it's very frank. I mean, if you read that book, I would encourage anybody who's interested in the subject of propaganda to read How Change Happens by Cass Sunstein.
Is there ever a good reason? I don't know who it was, or in the last couple of weeks, I think someone from, I don't know if it was the Pentagon or somewhere in the government somewhere said that, propaganda there has always been an element of propaganda to government workings in the name of security and ensuring national identity and security. What would you say to that?
You're referring to the GEC, right? Where that government body was created. The gentleman who was running it, he said that, there's a master narrative, and this master narrative is what we call history, and, and propaganda aimed at the populace is a good thing. But here's the thing, propaganda was actually banned. It was illegal. It was illegal to do propaganda against the American people. John F. Kennedy even warned about that. He said, like, anything that was done in secrecy and darkness was, contrary to the principles of a republic. For a republic to be able to operate, you need true information to have that feedback mechanism. And so if everybody's operating from false premises, they can't make informed decisions. Kind of like with COVID, you can't make an informed decision because they didn't tell you about the actual contraindications and iatrogenic effects of the therapeutic that they were kind of pushing on people. And that, by the way, as well, we just did some reporting on the New American side about something called ARPA-H. And ARPA-H was an ARPA program. Many of the viewers right now might be aware of DARPA, the Defense, Advanced Research Project Agency. And so ARPA is like a smaller kind of, subsidiary of that. And a lot of different organizations within the military have their own ARPA program. Like there's an ARPA program for geoengineering, an ARPA program for finance, an ARPA program for healthcare. And it was called ARPA-H. And Biden just mentioned that in the State of the Union and went over everybody's head. And so we're finding out now that COVID was run by the military. It was run by, the Defense Department. And so the actual healthcare people were third down in the chain of command. So everybody was like yelling at Pfizer or yelling at Moderna or this. They had no power. They took the money. They were happy to take the money and kind of be the front man, but they were actually third down in the chain of command. So it's really interesting, like, to discover like how it happened, why it happened, the weaponization of healthcare, the manipulation, and how the media, as used by that military-industrial complex, was used to promote these things, and the algorithmic manipulations that Cass Sunstein oversaw. And they just made a reference to that as well in the COP27 document. Human Development Report 2021-2022 was the title of it, and that was for the climate change conference that just happened a couple months back. And they said that COVID was very instrumental in teaching us the techniques for propagandizing the public, how to shut down debate, how to close down all discussion. So I mean, they're learning, but they're learning the wrong lessons, like the elites.
Well, it's. I learned that apparently it's not very hard to sway and to influence and to basically coerce an entire industry, and by that I mean the medical institutions, into doing all the wrong things. I mean, they shut down the hospitals to everything but one disease, which also happened to have every symptom every symptom that exists, like normal
Exactly.
people would have, could be that. It was like that was just like crazy, you know. I had something else going on, and I remember it being such a big deal, so hard to get seen, and obviously now we're seeing the results of that. You know, people the neglect has caught up and whatnot, and so it's like, in a way, you kind of see why they think it's easy and they want to like hurt us like cattle. But it's like, I want to have more hope in people. You know, I want to be able to think that if people were presented with good arguments, that they would be like, oh, I see. Like, yeah, that doesn't make sense. You're right. And I know we have a lot of that. My impression is, and I want to know if you agree or disagree, is that my impression is that if it weren't for the overt propaganda, if it weren't surrounding you everywhere, you know, whether it be academia, whether it be media, more people would actually just say what they really believe, which is contrary to almost everything you see in the media. They'd be like, "Yeah, girls can't be boys." You know, it's like, "Yeah, I don't agree with that lifestyle," or you know, there's corruption there, or you know, I think the vaccines are harmful. But I think there's a lot of people who are not saying that still because they don't know they're allowed to.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Mark Crispin Miller a little back, and Mark Crispin Miller in his foreword to Propaganda by Edward Bernays, he said that the enemy of the propagandist is the investigative journalist. You know, and so like programs like this are excellent for kind of counteracting propaganda. This is the antidote to kind of like the mental malware that they upload into people. And so I mean, the best that we can do is, you know, you mentioned Robert Welch earlier, the best that we can do is education. And I think James Madison had an argument with Thomas Jefferson about a republic and how hard republics are to run because it requires an educated populace, an intelligent populace, an engaged
Mm-hmm.
populace. And he said, well, if they're not, you know, up to that level, we've got to educate them up to that level. You know, that's the solution, not just making everybody slaves. And so yeah, it's very hard. It's an uphill battle, but it's worth it. It's a battle that's well worth it, and it's a battle that you, Paul, you do every day, and
And
very very impressed by some of the stuff that you put out. So
well, I mean, so yeah, speaking of that, you guys, by you guys, I mean us here at the JBS, we launched a new daily show to help with this, you know, because clearly we're going on and we're saying we're here to produce truth, to combat and to neutralize the lies and the propaganda. Of course, the JBS has been doing this since its inception in 1958, and actually quite before, because Robert Welch, as you probably already know, he launched the American Opinion, the predecessor to the New American, and I believe 1957, somewhere before he actually launched the JBS, knowing full well that what we need is an educated populace. And because if he had such confidence that if we had people who actually knew the truth, that would automatically start paving or redirecting the path of the nation. And we still we believe that, and we're seeing that. Steve Bonta, the executive senior editor at the TNA, he wrote an interesting piece about 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago during the battle. Remember the struggle for the speakership, and his only point was that this is happening because we have 20 very constitutionally oriented legislators, and he said that's more than we've had in a long, long time, and he attributes that to the education efforts of the New American, of the JBS. But going back now, we have the New American TV, right? The New American TV with Rebecca Terrell. We just launched that. You're kind of you play a major role in that, but all our folks do. You want to tell us about that?
yeah, it's just a new daily show that we're starting, just as you said, Paul. And we just go over the news of the day and kind of try to show, the deeper systems. There was a woman, she's a bad girl, called Donella Meadows, and she unfortunately was part of the Club of Rome, but she wrote a really interesting book on systems theory called Thinking in Systems, Cybernetics. And in there, she talks about systems. Like systems are algorithms that repeat, right? Like our Constitution is a system. It's an algorithm, right? So every 4 years, a president is elected. Every 6 years, a senator. Every 2 years, a congressman, et cetera. And it repeats. Or you have systems in the sociological sphere, like Christmas. Every December 25th, Christmas comes around, or every July 4th, Independence Day. So these are algorithms that you set in various institutions. And so she said, if you understand the systems, then and you can see the repetitions. You can see, and she said if it doesn't repeat, it's not a system, right? So people are always like, oh, history repeats itself or history rhymes. No, systems repeat themselves. And because they repeat themselves, once you understand the system, you can anticipate what's going to happen. And so, people aren't psychic, but if you understand, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, you can guess, okay, blue, if I know that pattern, blue is likely to be the next in that series. And so she said the evening news is almost worthless because she said that these are data points, random data points out of context. And she said, and they do not show the underlying system. And so we at the New American TV with Rebecca Terrell, we're trying to kind of show like the daily news cycle, but then to go a little bit deeper and show the underlying systems so that you understand why this happened, not just that it happened, but why did it happen, and hopefully we'll do better at that. And we have various segments as well, related to some of our other great reporting and stuff, some really fantastic journalism and panels on issues of the day. So hopefully you guys will tune in and we will help combat the propaganda by being the enemies of the propagandists, which means we're going to be blacklisted and hated. So.
We'll get a plaque for that. I always I don't want to say look forward to, but I like to make the most of media smears, and I put together an entire pamphlet crediting a lot of our success and reinforcing that with how much the major media hates us for it. But you had mentioned earlier the investigative journalist, and one of your top stories was actually one of the top stories that we reported was based on one by someone who's one of the most credible investigative journalists, that being Seymour Hersh, and that being the Nord Stream pipeline. And I think that's a really great example of how here you have something that happened that is so huge, and yet mainstream media is almost completely mum about it. I think that's a perfect example of the difference between real news, real alternative media, and propaganda mainstream media. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, they were trying to hide the public and distract them with balloon stories and UFOs. They had, I think we were talking about today, John Kennedy, who's a senator from Louisiana, I think, and he told people, oh, well, I was just in this secret session and people better lock their doors because of aliens. And, and so they were just ramping this up, and it was a distraction method to get people to not talk about the Nord Stream pipeline and that revelation that the United States had in fact committed an act of war, what amounts to an act of war against Russia by blowing up another nation's pipeline. And there was another situation as well, where there was a revelation some months back with the Minsk II agreements that were supposed to, kind of create like a detente between Russia and the Ukraine. And then Angela Merkel of Germany admitted that it was just a stalling tactic. We never meant to have peace. It was just a stalling tactic, so that we could get like munitions and tanks and anti-aircraft artillery into the Ukraine. And so Russia, when Russia found out about this, I mean, they were like, you guys are bad faith actors. We can't trust you. And so with the Nord Stream 2 revelations, that's ramped up even more. And so we're like in the, global tensions are the highest that they've been. Henry Kissinger said that. He said that we're the closest to World War III that he's ever seen, and he's going to be 100 years old in a couple months. So yeah, I mean, the media is basically there to deflect and keep us ignorant and keep us talking about balloons or celebrities or perversions, anything that's a circus sideshow freak, something that 100 years ago would have been, oh look, it's the tattooed lady or it's the bearded lady or the dog-faced boy. That's what they concentrate on, and they want you concentrating on these anomalous particulars because they don't want you to concentrate on the general and on the system. They don't want you to notice what's actually happening in the larger, the larger institutional geopolitical structures. And I mean, they're very, very good at keeping most of the populace, remarkably ignorant. So yeah, I mean, the only thing that we can do is what we're doing now, and and we are seeing dividends, so that's good as well.
Now, what do you what do you mean? Elaborate on that. What are you seeing that makes you say that?
Well, I just mean in the sense you mentioned places where people get propagandized, and one of those is the university, one of those is mass media. One of those is, kindergarten to grade 12 school. And there's a Freedom Project Academy, which is
Mhm.
affiliated with the John Birch Society. Homeschooling is exploding. And the
Yes.
solution to a lot of this is homeschooling. You taking your kid out of the propaganda matrix, not giving them mental malware, not, sitting them in a class that teaches them they're in the wrong body or that their country is inherently sinful, and they need to destroy everything and destroy themselves, because it's designed to destroy you. It's not designed to help you, like your parents would be, and so I mean to basically have these kids, I mean homeschooling is exploding in popularity right now, and that is going to show the dividends in the next generation. A lot more people, a lot more kids are getting educated as to their form of government, their history, their true history. Not, oh, America started in 1965 with the civil rights movement, and America is racist and bad, and that's the end. It's
Yeah.
like,
Good God. Well, yeah, I mean they've been freaking out about that too. There's been a massive increase. I'm not sure. I think we're up to 10 to 12. Is it 10 to 12% now? Somewhere around there as far as students, K through 12 students who've been pulled out of government schools. And that's obviously something near and dear to our heart here, like you had mentioned. Freedom Project Academy, that's our affiliate school. And so we really encourage people to do that. I want to read this one last thing to you and then we'll wrap it up. But I think this kind of, I was going to get your take on it. So in the latest Chronicles issue, Michael Rechtenwald wrote this. He says, "It is a minor miracle that Republicans have won some recent elections and have proven that they can still win elections in the U.S. Soviet states of America because almost every major legacy media outlet, every major social media platform, and Google, the company with near absolute control over information, is a leftist authoritarian organ of the state run by the Democratic Party." So do you think that's more a testament to the fact that the Democratic Party, the left is their ideas are so terrible and so asinine, and that Republicanist ideas are so naturally appealing? Because based on that, what I'm seeing is like, if we just remove some of these propaganda outlets, or at least we blunten them, we can have a return to sanity within the next generation. What are your thoughts on that?
yeah, exactly. And that's why they're terrified. I mean, imagine if all the like they said during some of the recent elections in Arizona, as an example, and they said that Republican turnout was 4 times what Democrat turnout was, and then, so imagine if they didn't have mail-in ballots with signatures that didn't match the real,
Right, right.
I mean, it would be the whole country would be red if we had kind of,
If they didn't
election
cheat,
integrity.
we'd have the
Yeah,
Senate too. I
yeah,
think
so
that's
you
what.
see this disconnect between the populace and the media, and they're not aligning. And the media is supposed to be there to advocate for the populace. It's supposed to be like an intelligence agency for the populace. So before the CIA existed, we had what was called, the fourth estate, which was the media, and they were supposed to hold, the powerful to account, speak truth to power. They were
Mhm.
supposed to tell the little guy what was happening. And kind of because of that sociological phenomenon that we talked about at the very opening, where we have a surplus of college graduates. Instead of advocating and identifying with the little guy, they were trained in college to identify with the ruling class and to become kind of a spokesperson for the ruling class. And they see it as sophisticated and elite. Hey, I went to college, and it kind of trains them to suck up to the powerful, and who give the grants for the journalism schools and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So the power dynamic has really changed, because the quality of the journalists has really changed. I have a friend who's 19 and he's going to a journalist class, and he sends me some of the stuff that he has to sit through. And he's just like, for instance, one of the lesson plans was, okay, if you're going to report on Father's Day, why don't you report two gay fathers with an adopted black child? That was literally what the lesson plan said. And the teacher also told him, you need to make white people feel uncomfortable. That's your job. And so this bumper crop of kids are being just raised
Good
to
God.
like do social justice kind of propaganda,
No
and
matter the
it's,
major, huh?
yeah, exactly. But especially journalism. I mean, they're just, kind of deployed now to never ever speak truth to power, ever, ever, ever. And it's just basically attacking, the working class who they're now trained to see as knuckle dragging cavemen, who they're now trained to despise. And that's very new. I mean, all of our classical journalistic icons like H.L. Mencken, he didn't go to college. He's our greatest like journalist ever in the history of the country. Mark Twain, like all these people, and they were men of the people. But once they go to the college, there's a selection mechanism, not for intelligence, but for obedience, and they become very obedient to the people, who are funding grants and subsidies. So.
And yet, with all that, still, well, I guess we'll finish up on this. It's we still not that we it's beyond just having hope. If we get enough people, we could reach a tipping point where we get enough people to turn away and realize what propaganda is and turn toward truth. We can right this ship. And I think it's already begun, to tell you quite frankly. We see the numbers, we see the polls on the media trust, and I don't know if they're a record low, but they're extremely low. And then we're seeing people go toward alternative media. Alternative media is growing, and obviously we see that with us, but we see that with so many others in the alternative media landscape. So all that to say is that we just need more people. We need more folks to realize what the truth is, and we need folks to share news stories and news sources that they can depend on. Would you want to add anything to that? And we'll wrap it up with that.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. The CIA did a study, and they noticed, as they were deposing countries around the world, and they kind of did a scientific study of it, and they said that it requires 3.5% of the population to be kind of conscious, to be able to flip a society. And that number was true in the American Revolution, 3.5%. And there was a gentleman named David Goldberg, and he said behind the scenes, they're panicking because of social media and the ability for normal people to communicate with each other through YouTube and all these other platforms, that it's now up to 17%. And they're panicking, and they're like locking down the society because people are waking up. We are winning. Like, for instance, like the John Birch Society, before the John Birch Society, the average person wasn't aware of globalism. The average person wasn't. I mean, these are mainstream ideas now, or the Federal Reserve not being federal or a reserve, and these like, there was an article, I think you, Paul, kind of did it in a compendium about some mainstream media legacy thing, saying that the John Birch Society concept is now the mainstream. So we're winning, and they're panicking.
They've done several articles on that. And then last year and the year before, I think one was called We All Live in the John Birch Society's World Now, is written by the New Republic. Yeah. And then there is one called The Birchers Never Left. I think it's by the same outlet. And then Salon did a few. One titled something to the degree, like it was lumping Alex Jones and all these folks. And they're like, here, you can thank the John Birch Society for all of this, what's happening. And we're proud of that. Not that we're proud in the sense that when you read between the lines, like you said, what that means is people are awakening. And I like what you said. We are winning. That makes sense. That's why they want to censor what you can say on the internet, or this stuff will just go bonkers. It'll go crazy.
Any website that doesn't have censorship immediately becomes John Birch like material immediately.
Yeah, and I don't want us to take all the credit as well. Obviously, there are others, but I think one of the biggest helpers for us has been, unfortunately, it has been reality. It has gotten to the point where people are just like, what in the world is going on? It just doesn't match. And so we're glad that people are realizing the truth. Obviously, we would have hoped that would have happened sooner, so we didn't get to this point. But the good news is, me and you are sitting here and we're talking, and soon we're going to broadcast this to other people. And then you're going to be doing a video, and you're going to do your show, and that's going to get broadcast to thousands, and possibly tens and hundreds of thousands at some point. And what that says is that people are waking up, and they have a hunger for the truth and not the propaganda. So Daniel, thank you so much for joining me, man. And thank you for sitting down to discuss this.
Thanks, Paul. You're the best.
So folks, there is no national restoration without an information revolution, which I believe, and as we've discussed, has already begun. Media trust is very low these days, and for good reason, just like we've shown. On the other hand, alternative media have been gaining lots of grounds over the years. So now's the time to introduce people to pro-American, truthful news and information sources. It's the least patriots can do, and it's necessary to restore our nation. So be part of that. We encourage members and supporters to share with friends and family members true news sources, including the New American Magazine and the New American's new daily show, The New American TV with Rebecca Terrell, which you can find at thenewamerican.com. So the New American has been ahead on the issues for nearly 40 years, reporting the truth behind the news. And once you're ready to move beyond knowing the truth to acting on it, we encourage you to apply for JBS membership and get plugged into effective activism. Our members are working across the nation, working to create understanding and to stop globalist schemes. So in the meantime, thank you for tuning in, and always remember that whatever the societal ailment is, freedom is always the cure.